So today I'm here to talk about my top 10 favorite science fiction books written by women. And yes, this is a response to the video I recently did talking about my all-time favorite science fiction books. And when I did that top 10, a lot of you in the comments noticed the fact that they were all written by men. This was not an intentional choice, but rather just what happened. I went to my shelves, I looked at my Goodreads list, and I put together the 10 science fiction books as standalones that I felt most strongly about. And then when I looked at the authors, I happened to notice they were all men. I did consider artificially changing up my list in order to include at least one woman because it definitely didn't look great, especially as a female reviewer. But if I was honest, all of those books really do stand up to the test of time. They're my favorite books at that moment, at least when I filmed the video. And so I decided to keep the video and list as is. But in response to that, I want to do a video talking about some of the science fiction books written by women that almost made the cut. If I redid that list as a top 20 or top 25, a lot of the books I'm going to talk about here would have made the list. A few housekeeping tips before we get started is the fact that I'm only going to include one book per author just to allow for more variety in the works. And again, I'm going to include both standalones as well as books that are more part of a companion series. So if a book is part of a strictly sequential chronological series, I'm not going to include it here. So favorites of mine like Ada Hoffman as well as Anne Lucky will not be featured here. I love their trilogies, but I'm going to include them in a different video instead. All that being said, let's get into the books. So at number 10, we have A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. It's the second book in the Wayfarer series, but it is a companion series, so I feel safely to recommend and include it here. This is my favorite book in the companion series, and I do believe it could be read as a standalone, although the setup is largely based off what happens in the first book. So in this one, without spoiling too much, we follow a character who is an artificial intelligence. The book deals heavily with themes of personhood, as you would expect when you have an AI character, and also deals with motherhood, which you'll find in this video is one of my favorite themes that I think especially female authors tend to do really well. I like this out of all the Wayfarer books because in my mind it's actually the grittiest. It has some meat to it and isn't quite as rosy and optimistic as the other books, which might seem strange as a criticism of the series, but I do like my books darker. And so this one really spoke to me more than the others because it added a level of realism that comes with that grittiness of real life and the reality, the struggles that people endure, and I thought that this book best captured that. So I recommend this one. Even if you don't love the whole series, just go check out this one. It's a personal favorite of mine. Next, at number 9, we have Escaping Exodus by Nikki Drayden. Now, technically, this is the first book in a duology, but I don't really love the second book. I don't think it adds anything to the series, so I'm going to pretend that this is a standalone. Now, this is a space opera that really falls into the sci-fantasy category because while it is set in space, it definitely leans into more of the fantasy tropes. We follow two different perspectives of these women on this spacefaring creature. They traveled through space on this creature, and so we follow the perspective of someone who is soon to be the leader. They are the daughter of the clan leader, and so will eventually take their place. And then we also follow the perspective of someone who is a worker on the beast, and so they are a lower class citizen. The two of them have a romance, and the story goes from there as they begin to wonder about the fate of their colony as they realize what they're doing to the beast that they are traveling in. So this book, obviously, as I mentioned, has a large fantasy romance part, which is not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but the actual science ideas surrounding the story, the idea of space travel through this beast, leans into my love of sci-fi horror. And certainly it's not meant to be horrifying, but it does lean just a touch into the grotesque. This book gets weird, it gets strange, which is something I've come to really love. And it's just a book that hits the right beats. Again, it has that familiar narrative, things that you've seen before if you follow a lot of books and movies and things that follow similar setups. But in terms of a story, I had a great time reading this one. Highly recommend it. It was one of my earlier entries into science fiction as an adult, and I continue to think about it. It was just a good time, and I would definitely read more by this author this year. And I also want to talk about Down Below Station by CJ Cherry. This is another companion book in a series, but again, a very loose one, so you're free to jump into this one. Each book in the series basically follows different characters, plots, etc. They're just set in the general same universe. This one is a space opera that deals with politics, interpersonal relationships, and it's just a very classic modern space opera that I recommend to people who love things like The Expanse and are looking for something similar, where again you have really interesting fleshed out characters, you have political intrigue, maneuvering, and you're trying to figure out who's on whose side. There's always the evil corporations behind things and so forth. I just really like this one. It's a book that, while it didn't necessarily blow my mind, it didn't change my worldviews, I had a great time reading it, and it was just so well done. There was very little about this book, if anything, that I would actually change. change. It was just a solid space opera. It was my first time reading CJ Cherryh, and it definitely will not be my last. I'm planning to read a lot of her books this year, and I hope to find more favorites among there. Next, let's talk about The Light Brigade by Cameron Hurley, and this is a military science fiction thriller that follows someone who decides to go off and join the military after there has been a horrible attack by Mars. And so in the military, they have this technology that allows them to jump through space very quickly, being turned into light, and so we follow them as they were going about on these missions. And this is a book that you have to be very careful talking about because there is more to it than it seems, and finding that out for yourself is such a delight. This book is so smart and so well written in terms of the plotting. Cameron Hurley has easily become a favorite author of mine. I've loved several of their fantasy books, and we're going to talk science fiction. This is the one I wanted to highlight here because if you want twisty, turny stories where you're reading it and then you have to basically stop and read it all over again because once you know what's going on, you're going to want to look back and see all the clues along the way. This book is just so well executed, and I think that again, if you're looking for really intelligently written science fiction, this is definitely one you got to put on your list. Next, I want to talk about The Electric Florist by Tanith Lee, and this is a book I recently read, so I'm torn about the fact that perhaps this book should be higher up on the list, but I worried about recency bias. So as I talked about before, this story follows a character who is physically disabled and gets the opportunity to go into another body. However, as an agreement for this, she also has to go and perform some espionage. So this book is filled with political intrigue. She has to pretend to be someone she's not and try to figure out who is behind this larger plot happening. This book has some really creative, complex world building surrounding it. You can see that the author has, again, influence and typically writes in fantasy. So the story and narrative has that fantasy feel to it, but is very much centered around a world where science rules supreme, and you get to see how the author uses that science in some really creative ways. I don't want to spoil too much of the plot. It's one that took a while to get going, and I wasn't entirely sure where it was going to, but when you get to the ending, I promise I don't want to oversell a book, but the ending is fantastic and will make you reframe the entire story. It is such a gut punch. I read it several times and highly recommend this book. Again, maybe it should be even higher on this list, but I'll have to give it more time before I solidify if it deserves a spot in the top 5. Now, moving into the top 5, let's talk about Before Mars by Emma Newman. This is the third book in the Planetfall series, but again, if you want to start here, you definitely can. I read this book second, skipping over book 2, which was an interesting reading experience. This one follows a woman who has taken a job to work on Mars for a period of time. She's left behind not just her husband, but also her young child. And this, of course, is seen in a negative light, really questioning what kind of mother would leave not just her child, but I believe the child is under 2, leaving them behind to go on this mission that is relatively long term. When they get to Mars, they find something, a warning, a note written in their own handwriting telling them that there's more going on. And so this mystery science fiction story ensues. This is one that I love on so many levels. I am a sucker when it comes to science fiction mysteries, as long as they're done well. And this one was very well plotted. I was very much intrigued, and I thought that the reveals, the ending, there were some great aha moments. My jaw dropped, and I really loved it. And then, as I've talked about in other videos, again, I really love complicated, sometimes terrible depictions of mothers. I like books that challenge the common mold, even if they're unflattering. I thought it was really interesting to say, what would it look like to have a woman choose her career over her family, when especially when you see a lot of male astronauts have done that, but it's seen very differently when it's done by a woman. And so I love those conversations, those questioning of gender divides and norms, and I just really love this one for a lot of different reasons. I thought the character work was fantastic. And again, this is a book that really made me fall in love with the Planetfall series, so if you haven't checked it out, I do recommend it. You might want to read the first book, Planetfall, first, but again, if you're only curious about this one, you can jump in. I'm giving you permission. At number 4, we have The Relentless Moon by Mary Robinette Kowal, and this is the third book in the Lady Astronaut series, but this one is very much a companion story because it follows it from a different character perspective than the first 2 books, although it does feature the other characters. So again, you could start back at the beginning, but I encourage you to jump in here if you're just interested in this one. This follows the character Nicole, who is going off to a mission on the moon. There's possibly some kind of espionage. There is someone possibly sabotaging the moon project, and so they're sent there to go and figure out what is going on. So again, you have the great mystery setup in a sci-fi universe. I love the character work in this one, and especially I do put this book at the rank that I do because of the fact that I lean into really seeing myself in the character of Nicole. She suffers from an eating disorder, and I saw a lot of myself and my struggles in her. It was just Really nice, connecting on so many levels. They also had a subplot of infertility. So it is a story that, as you can probably tell from my description, is very character focused. So it's not necessarily going to focus as much in the world building as other books I'll mention on this list. But if you're looking again for that really interesting female representation, strong female character with a mystery story surrounding it, this one is very well done and I really liked it. I know that while again she doesn't lean hugely to the world building, the science that she does put into these books are very accurate. I like that at the end of this book, this author has a whole afterword discussing the science in this book, involving the different talk about smallpox and different vaccinations and things along the way, and explains all of the science she was able to pack into the book. And I just thought that was really nice, again, seeing a book that is built on hard science fiction but still having a character focused plot. And so highly recommend this one. If you share my niche taste in books, you might enjoy it as well. Next, let's talk about Kindred by Octavia E. Butler, which of course is an iconic piece of historical fiction and science fiction that involves a woman in the then present day when the book is written who is living her life. Something happens. She ends up finding this boy, saving his life. However, by doing so, she ends up being back in time. She has to figure out where she is, what is going on. She temporarily meets the boy's family and soon realizes that she has a familiar relationship or connection to this family of the past. This book, as I mentioned, is again set over 2 periods, and so the period of the past deals with a lot of the prejudice and slavery of that time, so it's very much a book examining social class, prejudice, etc. As I mentioned, this book is set over 2 timelines, and so in the past it's very heavily centered around the racial divide that was so much more prevalent in the past of America, and so that plays a major aspect of the plot. Personally, I'm not a huge science fiction reader, which is perhaps the only reason this book isn't even higher on this list, but while it is not entirely the kind of thing that I normally read, it is so well done, and I adore this author so much that I had to make a place on this list. So I'd love to hear from y'all. What is your favorite Octavia A. Butler book? Because there definitely were a few contenders on this list, but I decided to go with this one at this time. And at number 2, we have The Speed of Dark by Elizabeth Moon, which is one of my favorite all-time books, as long as you don't read the last chapter or 2. So this is a book that follows a young person on the autism spectrum. They are living in a near future. They have their friends, their life, and they get an opportunity or are offered the opportunity to go through a process that will take away their autism and have them become a neurotypical person. And so within this entire book, we deal with them grappling with that choice. And this is a book that has some of the most beautiful representation of someone who is neurodiverse. I love the descriptions, the way that we get to see their mind. The title of the book refers to the way that they process things differently and see the world in an entirely different way. I thought it was a great book, not just even specifically about ASD, but really just about how we treat people who are seen as different than us, whether it be a learning disability or a different way of thinking, etc. And so I love the acceptance, the discussions within this book. It was really beautiful and nuanced until that ending. If I'm honest, with the ending, this book should not be on this list. This book should be in the trash, and this book should be on my most disappointing list of all time. But if you ignore the ending, it's one of my favorite books. I've never been so conflicted recommending a book as I am with this one, because I love the book until the author sticks her foot in her mouth and ruins the whole thing. So if you read it, you know what I mean, and I'd love to hear from all of you if you share my conflicted feelings about this one. So it's number 2 if I didn't hate the ending of this book, so I'm just gonna ignore the ending and stick it here because I didn't know where else to place it on this video. And finally, in the number 1 spot for my favorite science fiction standalone by a woman is none other than The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which is a fantastic piece of dystopian fiction. I've talked about Margaret Atwood so many times on my channel, so it's probably an eye roll moment for a lot of you that she ended up on top of this list. Again, I love all of these books, but when I'm looking at the holistic picture of their work, Margaret Atwood's books just tend to reign above a lot of others. I think that she is fantastic in terms of her prose, her style to her books, the narrative. All of it is very unique, and I do recognize or understand that not everyone loves the style that The Handmaid's Tale is written. It has a different style that can be off-putting to certain people, and I do get that because I had mixed feelings even myself as I was reading it the first time, but it is just a fantastic story that I feel is as relevant today as it was when it was written. I love that this author brings in stories and ideas that are just so frighteningly possible because that's something she prides prides herself in is pulling things that are already happening in places in the world and turning them into a dystopian that is more fact than fiction in some points. And so I love this one for so many reasons. It's gripping, it's dark, it's memorable. It's a kind of book that you don't necessarily have a great time reading it. You don't necessarily have fun reading it, but it packs a punch. It leaves an impact on you, and that is something I look for in my fiction. I don't always have to like a story. I don't always have to have a great time with it, but if it leaves me thinking about it for days and years after, then you know the book is doing something right. And that is what I think about when I think about The Handmaid's Tale. One of the most memorable books I ever read, one of my favorite books to reread. Highly recommend. It is definitely worth your time. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know, of the books I talked about, are there any that you're planning on checking out for yourself? I'd also love to hear, what is your favorite science fiction book written by a woman? If I haven't checked it out yet, I definitely will in the future. My intention is to redo my all-time favorite science fiction books in the future, and again, hopefully naturally, without even trying, include men and women just simply based off of having read more women, that they'll naturally be included in those top tier books. So again, I'd love to hear from all of you. Favorite books by women. Let me hear your picks down below. We'll discuss it more there, and I'll get some recommendations. If I haven't heard of them yet, that's always a great chance for me to add to my own TBR. If you're new to my channel and do want to stick around, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and other dark things. If you want to help me out with this video, give it a big thumbs up. If you want to drop a comment, how about a stack of books so I know you're here? And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.